This video is sponsored by Everwinter, a multi-gaming convention held in Waltham, Massachusetts this December. You can get tickets at wikidicey.com/Everwinter, and there'll be more about that later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's that time of the year again. We are post-autumn Dataslate 2023. So, today we're going to be breaking down every single faction in Warhammer 40k and ranking them in a big tier list. Now, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different this time around, and I've assigned each tier a number rather than a letter or a funny name. Mostly, this is because what I want to do is present this as a gradient rather than assigning each faction to a specific tier. So basically, I don't really consider the top of tier 4 and the bottom of tier 3 significantly differently. I just think that that bottom tier 3 is one step above the next faction. Now, I also don't want to present this as those factions necessarily being strictly better than one another. Most of them have different matchups, good or bad, and whether or not those matchups are useful or impactful in the metagame is what places a faction in a particular ranking. So at the end of this power ranking, we're going to have a little bit more of a standard distribution than skewed one way or another to a particular tier. Now, generally looking at the season is going to be kind of funny because we can't really rely on the results from the previous season to educate where these factions are going to be placed. Not only did things change significantly from the release of 10th edition to the first data slate, with whole factions being almost entirely rebuilt, both from points values and their mechanics, but the dominance of sub-factions like Aeldari and Genestealer Cults really skewed any data that we could have accrued from previous events. It's difficult to look at win rates or any particular matchup data from the last season and use that to inform this season, because honestly, most of that stuff was being depressed by the dominance of Aeldari or just is no longer relevant. So this is going to be largely sight unseen. As always, I reserve the right to be totally wrong, and if you disagree with me, let me know down in the comment section and let's have a talk about it. The most interesting thing I think about the power level in this season is going to be a compression of the strength of relative factions. Less are we going to see certain factions in leagues of their own entirely dominant over the rest of the game, and I think every faction now has the opportunity to compete, at least at some level, where many factions at the beginning of the edition didn't really have the opportunity to compete even at the small GT or 3-round event. I don't think that's the case anymore. And even the factions at the bottom of the tier list, in some circumstances, now have the tools to at least compete with factions higher up and towards the top. So let's dive in and talk about exactly where those factions land. We'll start at tier 5 here, where we see a lot of factions basically staying in the same place that they did previously. Adepta Sororitas are still down here, not really seeing any mechanical changes, just a bunch of points value deductions. They got huge points cuts across the entirety of their faction, and while the real problems with the faction lied with their access to high strength weaponry, and that hasn't really been alleviated in this balance update, what they are going to be able to do is create armies full of more mid-strength weapons, things like multi-meltas and their tank varieties, and they're going to have tons and tons of scoring units. Those all make Adepta Sororitas, while not a particularly consistent faction, they do give them a couple more legs, but a bunch of mad matchups, and being relatively fragile, they do also have the opportunity to accidentally just get blown off the table. Moving on, we have Drukhari, who sort of received kind of a side grade in the update. Unfortunately, they were kind of caught in the crossfire between the Craft World and Ynnari updates, seeing a massive points increase on one of the strongest units in their index, the Ravager. These things packed 3 Dark Lances and came in at a staggeringly cheap 95 points. Basically, every single Drukhari list ran 3 of them, and unfortunately, they did go up over 20% in their points value, going to 115. That cuts a bunch of points out of Drukhari lists, and while they did recoup that with a little extra from points deductions elsewhere in the codex, it still means that they are mostly staying, I think, a little closer to the previous points value than Drukhari players would have liked. That said, they do have a lot more tools to play with this time around, and I think Drukhari are still excellent at playing a secondary objective scoring game, and unlike Adepta Sororitas, do have a lot of those anti-tank weapons, being able to pack ridiculous numbers of Dark Lances with hit rerolls from pain tokens into the faction, which certainly helps shores up their game plan, but again, doesn't make it particularly consistent. Next up in this tier, we have World Eaters, and this was a tough one to place, because honestly, I do think that World Eaters have some extremely viable archetype. There are very successful World Eaters lists running mass infantry, jackals, berserkers, protected by demon princes, granting them 4+ invulnerable saves, and if you don't have the high volume anti-infantry sweeping to clear those types of armies, they'll basically run you over. But I think it remains to be seen how consistent those armies are. I believe that we are going to be seeing a little bit more of a skew into infantry in this coming season, and it may be that players build against those infantry lists, which will most likely catch World Eaters in the crossfire. So I think that World Eaters has a lot of viable archetypes to stand on. The big question is whether or not relying on melee and sort of spammy archetypes in this edition is actually going to be helpful in an edition that is traditionally pretty toxic to both those things, but that really remains to be seen. I'm definitely pulling for World Eaters players. I do think that there is a lot of depth in the faction that has been returned by this data slate, but I don't know if it's enough to compete with the top dogs. As the year grows colder and there's not but the icy nip of Jack Frost outdoors, what's better than to curl up with a hot mug of cocoa next to the roar of indoor central heating and one of the largest miniature gaming events of the year? Everwinter is one of the many amazing events presented by Wicked Dicey. Veterans of this channel might recognize some of Wicked Dicey's past events like Everwinter 2022 and Ironweld, which both supported the channel and I covered on stream. They were amazing events, and Wicked Dicey always puts on an amazing show, but this year they are coming back bigger and better than ever. Everwinter is a cross-denominational miniature gaming extravaganza now at a new location in Waltham, Massachusetts. This gaming convention features competitive play for a frankly dizzying number of miniature games, including a full-size Age of Sigmar GT, a Star Wars Legion Championship, and events for other games such as Malifaux, Infinity, X-Wing, Armada, Conquest, Song of Ice and Fire, Middle-earth strategy battle game, and many more, including, let's be honest, the one that you're probably the most interested in, a full-scale Warhammer 40k major. Last year, Everwinter brought together close to 100 40k players for their major, and this year promises to be even bigger. If competition isn't quite your style, there is also a variety of casual and narrative events to choose from, as well as a variety of board games and hobby workshops so you can hone those paintbrush skills. I couldn't be more excited for Everwinter 2023, and I will be there all weekend. So please come and join me December 8th through 10th at the Westham Waltham, Boston, and head on over to wickeddicey.com/Everwinter for more information and to get your tickets today. I'll see you on the battlefield, gamers. Moving on to the next tier, Tier 4, we see a lot of the other factions that we saw at the bottom of the game previously, starting with Adeptus Mechanicus. These guys got some points cuts and a nice buff to their infantry. While I don't think it's enough to really spam the infantry, since I'm not sure Skitarii is really a spammable profile, they did get additional points to take units like Honor Dragoon Crawlers and Cataphront Breachers, both of which are incredibly strong data sheets and cement Admech as a pretty functional gun line. The downside is that they're relatively one-dimensional, they don't have a ton of maneuverability, and while they will win versus a lot of armies in a direct shootout, a lot of their armor cracking relies on the anti-vehicle keyword, which can be a little bit matchup specific. They're also still saddled with a kind of really bad detachment ability with their Rad Bombardment, which occasionally can sometimes be useful, but generally speaking, just wastes a bunch of time off your chest clock and does like 1 or 2 mortal wounds per turn. That said, with the faction mostly based around kind of mediocre attack profiles like Weapon Skill and Ballistic Skill 4 across the majority of data sheets, they are really relying on their synergies to get work done, and I don't know if those points cuts are enough to make those combined synergistic units that efficient. Moving on, we have Death Guard. These guys I would like to see farther up on the list, and they did get some huge points decreases and some super sweet synergies, especially with decreases to data sheets like Chaos Demons, being able to create really interesting combinations of effect. In past editions, Death Guard, being a primarily anti-melee defensive faction, had some incredibly striated matchups where against aggressive melee matchups, they were extremely effective, but enemies that could land a high volume of high damage shooting were able to take them out, and I think that that's basically where they have returned to in this edition. If you can't deal with their Nurgling squads and they start to stack up the effects from their contagions, where you're getting -1 weapon skill and -1 to hit, or potentially reducing their objective control characteristics, so teleporting factions can't necessarily steal objectives away, Death Guard are going to excel. Downside is that they still don't really have too many defensive benefits, unless they can project their -1 to hit aura very aggressively up the table, which is theoretically possible. It's not particularly reliable, and Death Guard don't really have much else going for them when it comes to surviving enemy ranged attacks. I think that's still going to be depressing the power of the faction, but they are so much more powerful than they were in the pre-Dataslate version. They do have some really interesting good matchups that can create really interesting combo builds where they can stack toughness debuffs, save debuffs, alongside the benefits from their characters and make even their combi bolters do ridiculous damage, and I think that is super cool. Now moving on to Chaos Demons, this was one of the most surprising factions to me that got hit in the nerfs. They were doing okay in the pre-Data Slate season, but not particularly well, and they basically got a side grade on their points values, with some of their most played greater demons like Shalaxi Hellbane, Lords of Change, and Bloodthirsters all going up, but their infantry going down. Unfortunately, while the infantry is extremely useful and very, very good at taking objectives, you don't really want to focus on them for actually dealing your damage, and that's usually where the greater demons come in. So those big armor cracker demons like Shalaxi going up really hampered the power level of the faction. Now, I do think Chaos Demons do have an extremely strong game plan. They can still teleport around the table, drop within 3 inches of enemies, and steal objectives away from them while applying less damage to their opponent. And being a faction that was relatively inconsistent and kind of relied on things like high volume attacks from Bloodthirsters or high reliability attacks from Shalaxi to actually clear hard targets that they didn't have other answers for, with those units becoming less efficient, I think it's going to be a little bit tougher for demons to compete. Now, in this tier list, I have actually broken up all of these non-compliant Space Marine sub-factions. I didn't dig into the Space Marine Index sub-factions, but we will be talking about the chapters separately this time around, starting with Blood Angels. Now, while Blood Angels did get some pretty solid points decreases, I don't know if it was enough to catapult them to the same level as some of the other very unique and very useful sub-factions. Now, while at a base level, they are still going to be as strong as basically a normal Gladius task force out of the Space Marine Codex with a couple of different unit options, losing access to characters like Rabute Gilliman is a big loss, and I don't know if the inclusion of characters like Dante or units like Sanguinary Guard are enough to pull that back. While they did get points breaks on some of the most useful units in the index, units like Death Company with jump packs, which certainly helps Blood Angels stay competitive. On top of that, their specific detachment, which is meant to synergize the best with their units, being significantly worse than Gladius Task Force, with Gladius Task Force giving you advance and charge on demand, whereas the melee-specific Sons of Sanguinius Task Force not doing that is a sad time for the faction. You can just play Gladius Task Force, and it's basically better in every way, but in the comparison with other Space Marine chapters and even the compliant Space Marine chapters, I don't think it's quite as strong. That moves us on to probably one of the most improved factions in the game, Leagues of Votann, now sitting comfortably near the top of Tier 4. These guys got ridiculous points cuts to their army and huge benefits to the Judgment Token mechanics simply by changing their detachment roll to apply double Judgment Tokens to, honestly, the majority of the opponent's army from the beginning of the game, rather than relying on the Judgment Token mechanics and calls to apply them to enemy units naturally. This means that the faction has a lot of mechanics to shore up their relatively piddly offensive stats, and especially being able to include things like Hearthkin Warriors in Sagittars to complete their secondary objectives once their Hearthguard or Hearthkin Pioneers get knocked out, and doing so without breaking the space bank is hugely beneficial to the faction. And that moves us on to Imperial Knights. How far the mighty 3-story tall war machines have fallen. These guys were doing extremely well at the beginning of the season, where they had a bunch of event wins under their belts, but a couple of stacked core mechanical changes, changing the alpha strike power of the towering keyword alongside stopping their big knights from being able to overwatch, multiple nerfs to stratagems within the faction, increasing their costs and changing their types so that they cannot be duplicated by Canis Rex. On top of what is probably the biggest one, the removal of big knights being affected by their own bondsman abilities just changes the entire face of the faction, and I think has dropped their power levels significantly. That said, they didn't see points increases like Chaos Knights did, and they can still potentially skew into a pretty hefty anti-vehicle composition, essentially still being able to run what is effectively their 9th edition list, which was like 1 or 2 big knights with a bunch of buffs to bondsman abilities, buffing large numbers of armigers. And there are some factions that struggle dealing with that, so they are really going to be kind of in the middle of the road, being this skew army. They lost the interesting combos and a lot of their offensive power from before the data slate, but I think there are going to be some matchups that they still do okay in. Moving on from that, we have Imperial Guard. These guys got a big side grade, getting some hefty increases to their indirect fire while getting big breaks on their battle tanks. It is weird that Games Workshop really created them as like this indirect fire matters faction and then consistently nerf their indirect fire weapons, but it kind of is what it is. Generally, with the increase in efficiency of their battle tanks, as well as some hefty points cuts to their infantry squads as well, Astra Militarum does do a much better job at holding the middle of the table, which was a real issue for the faction in the past. And while their artillery is less powerful, that does mean they're more consistent overall. So while they are slightly better at holding primary objectives, they're probably still going to be running into some of the issues that they saw in the pre-Data Slate season. And that moves us on to Chaos Knights. Now, both of the Knights sub-factions got hit from a bunch of different angles, both with core rules changes and often with faction-specific changes. Chaos Knights specifically getting some points hikes on their War Dog units, which are kind of the most played unit archetype within the faction. That said, Chaos Knights did get something in return that Imperial Knights are kind of crying for, and that was a little bit of a sneak buff in a change to the Insane Bravery stratagem. Chaos Knights are incredibly focused on Battle Shock mattering. They force additional Battle Shock checks to wounded enemy units within 12 inches of them in each command phase, and can impose significant penalties on units when they are Battle Shocked. The downside is that because those Battle Shock checks were in the opponent's Battle Shock step, they were Insane Braveryable, meaning that your opponent could see the dice roll before deciding to use Insane Bravery, but that is no longer the case. In addition to that, you can only use Insane Bravery once per game. So, mid to low leadership factions are going to be absolutely dominated by Chaos Knights' control of the Battle Shock step. That is a huge benefit for them, and unlike Imperial Knights, they can also make use of the new towering changes. Whereas Imperial Knights, if they want to stay behind a ruin, will then have to spend a lot of their movement over the next turns moving their large bases around the ruin. Chaos Knights can simply phase through them with their stratagem. All of these together means that the changes to the faction were largely a side grade rather than a strict downgrade as we saw with Imperial Knights. Whether or not that makes them any better than the skew list that Knight factions typically are, we'll have to see, but I do think Chaos Knights are poised to do relatively well this season. Classic Space Marines are next and are unfortunately, I think, in kind of a doldrums right now awaiting their updated codex. They were very heavily focused on units like Desolators in the previous season, and with that unit basically being yeeted into the sun by multiple stacked nerfs, both to Overwatch, its unit size, and its points value, it's not particularly viable anymore. On top of that, Classic Space Marines, and especially Ultramarines, were extremely reliant on free stratagem effects like Robute Guilliman or Rites of Battle. Those have also been nerfed to only work on battle tactics, so the faction has been hit multiple ways. That said, they did get some points decreases, which has helped some of the other units like Land Raiders and Aggressors see more play, but I do think that there are potentially other sub-factions that use them better than the factions out of the Classic Marines. Definitely, Marines are never worse than their worst Gladius task force, and I think that you could almost take any of the Codex Compliant Space Marine chapters and have a pretty good time, but I don't know if it's going to be quite as impressive as some of the other Space Marine chapters that we'll talk about towards the top of the video. Space Wolves are next, and these guys are basically in a very similar boat. They did see some points decreases to units like Thunderwolf Cavalry. Getting those nerfs to Rites of Battle means that the multiple Thunderwolf Cavalry archetype with multiple Wolf Lords to give the units a lot of Armor of Contempt or reactive moves over and over and over again are a little bit less effective. Also, losing Desolation Squads and getting points increases to units like Gladiator Lancers definitely hurts Space Wolves as well. We'll just have to see what Space Marines get when their new codex comes out. I think that they're probably fine. They can build a lot of pretty solid archetypes in the current season, but they're most likely going to see a big boost in power once they get more options for additional detachments to play. From that, we're moving on to Deathwatch. This is another faction that has dropped precipitously from the previous version. Certainly not the powerhouse that they were in the pre-Dataslate era, but still probably relatively okay. They can no longer use their special ammunition stratagems on their special weapons or on non-bolter weapons, but that mostly transitions them to playing a couple more units like Sternguard Veteran or Indomitor kill teams who focus very heavily on those bolter weapons and are able to situationally adapt their ammo. A focus on a heftier combi weapon composition in Deathwatch, I think, definitely kind of fits the theme and also benefits a little bit from the fact that Devastating Wounds got a little bit of a side grade in its power level, no longer splitting its damage over multiple targets, but now being able to counteract any anti-mortal wound protection. This means that Deathwatch probably have a pretty solid matchup into things like Adeptus Custodes, where mass anti-infantry or mass Devastating Wounds is going to be able to knock down the faction relatively quickly. While their backline units like Desolators or Gladiator Lancers did get significantly nerfed, and that is going to hamper the power of the faction, I do think that they have a lot more flexibility than standard Space Marines do while having access to a bunch of unique units and particularly solid matchups into very specific enemies. Speaking of specific enemies, let's talk about Genestealer Cults. This is another one that got nerfed in a bunch of different ways. Between updates to their army rule, making it less consistent to respawn units, and massive points increases to both their infantry and characters, not to mention the fact that they were probably the #1 user of free stratagem effects, putting 2 or 3 Nexoses in almost every single list and duplicating stratagems as often as they possibly could. This faction's been nerfed in essentially every way. That still cements them as a relatively solid infantry swarm swarm faction, and they do have a lot of bite to them that other infantry swarms don't necessarily do. They can still put enormous amounts of damage out with Acolyte hybrids and at long range with Neophyte hybrids, using all of the synergies they did before. They're just not going to do so quite as efficiently or with the same redundancy that they did in the pre-Dataslate era. I'll be interested to see whether or not we still see Genestealer Cults taken at the top tables. I think that they received enough stacked nerfs to really make them less appealing as a competitive army. Now, we have kind of a similar story with Adepta Custodes. These guys got some pretty hefty points increases both to their infantry and characters. They got unit size limitations and nerfs to their stratagems as well. Not to mention the fact that they lost their protection against devastating wounds, meaning that their high defensive stats can't really protect them against armies that are spamming that mechanic. That makes them a lot more matchup specific than they were previously, where against high devastating wound count factions, they could just 4+ save through the worst of it. Now, in some situations, they're just going to be blown off the table, but their game plan remains sort of consistent, just slightly less efficient than it was. I think that does drop them a tier or two from the post-Dataslate era, but certainly keeps the faction live competitively. That moves us on to Thousand Sons. These guys, I don't think really changed too much in power level as much as were kind of replaced by factions that are now more efficient. They did get kind of massive points increases. A lot of lists went up between 1 and 200 points, which was a lot, but they were probably a hair too strong going on into the Dataslate. Their game plan hasn't really changed. The changes to devastating wounds were more of a side grade for the faction. Well, Magnus the Red can't necessarily blow like 20 infantry off the table by just fishing for a bunch of devastating wounds with full rerolls. Their smaller devastating wounds weapons, like their Sorcerer's Smites and the potential bolter devastating wounds they get when they turn their bolters into psychic weapons, are much more effective now, being able to shoot through things like anti-mortal wound feel no pains with impunity. This means that a lot of factions that were particularly resilient against Thousand Sons, like Adepta Custodes, now don't really have any defense against them and are going to get just lit up off the table. That said, the faction being less efficient overall does drop them down a little bit, but I think that they are certainly still just fine competitively. Moving on to another one of the most improved factions in the game, we are in tier 2 here and talking about Grey Knights. These guys were all about scoring and teleporting around the table and just basically got a ton of points decreases. They're like cheap as chips now. With the ability for 25-point Strike Marines to be teleporting around the table, picking up out of reserve, dropping back in, coming 3 inches away from you, objective securing your objectives away, the faction sounds like a nightmare to deal with and has a ton more units to play with. Given that it's a faction that's not really reliant on killing you and is mostly reliant on putting material on your objectives and scoring secondaries with them, having more efficient units is basically the name of the game. And this whole army is just going to be better at it. It was a very difficult and kind of non-standard game to play previously. They had some very specific matchups that they were play into, and they were very difficult to stop in those matchups. And I think now that the breadth of matchups that Grey Knights are going to be successful into is a little bit wider. They also potentially have more playstyles open with cheaper Land Raiders and Dread Knights. Whether or not we see those heavier weapons be taken instead of just more high OC units that can steal objectives away remains to be seen, but I appreciate that there are more than one list archetype available for them. That moves us on to Tyranids, and these guys are, I think right now, a big question mark, at least for the foreseeable future. In my opinion, Tyranids are kind of being buoyed by the fact that they are the first codex, and at least for the next couple weeks, the only faction with a codex, which means that in terms of playable detachments and flexibility, they are significantly advantaged over every other faction in the game. Tyranids now have the ability to hot swap between different detachments and change their composition depending on what they want to play or what else is strong in the metagame, and that is very appropriate for Tyranids, but is going to be a strength of other factions in the not too distant future. In my opinion, the real drawback for Tyranids of this data slate was yet it pulled the rug out of basically the classic Tyranid game plan. What the faction wanted to do was stack a lot of defensive buffs with their Hive Tyrants, making stratagems free and duplicatable, then have annoying to kill units take up the center of the table, force your opponent to engage into you, and allow their short range shooting like Zoanthropes to be able to counterpunch and actually kill enemy units. Tyranids are ludicrously pillow-fisted even with this new codex, and while they did get some tools like Neurolictors that can help with that, they aren't particularly consistent. That said, with Zoanthropes getting a massive points increase and huge nerfs to the Tyrants both points-wise and with the new stratagem duplication rules, where most of the Tyranid detachments kind of had their stratagems randomly assigned categories, there are some detachments that have almost all their stratagems in strategic ploy, and some of them where all their useful stratagems still are battle tactics. So whether or not the Tyrants can duplicate those stratagems was kind of just put up to a dice roll when the codex was designed. That game plan doesn't work quite as well. That said, Tyranids still have some solid units. They have have a decent front line. They still have a lot of pretty solid objective holders they can take, and their secondary game is still probably one of the best in the game, which certainly keeps Tyranids at this level 2. Now, another unit that saw some enormous glow-ups from the points changes, we have Tau Empire. I think it's becoming apparent that Tau Empire, while they already had a consistent game plan, they weren't particularly efficient. A lot of their most powerful units had kind of mediocre damage output that was then gated between extremely expensive profiles. And now, they just got huge points cuts basically across the entirety of the faction. You can play almost any archetype in the Codex extremely efficiently. They have auxiliary units like Kroot and Vespid that are super cheap. Even their support units like Stealth Battlesuits got decreases. Their infantry got massive cuts, dropping huge numbers of points on Breacher Teams and Devilfish. And they even saw points cuts to their most played units like Broadside Battlesuits and Crisis Battlesuits. On top of that, they had some of their heavier stuff like Storm Surges and Riptides get massive decreases as well to try to incentivize their play. And I think overall, the faction is just going to be ludicrously efficient. While they still have some problems with their top level damage output, they're still going to be relying on that sort of strength 8-2 damage profile for a long time. Because they have so much more to play with now, and they saw some huge decreases to high strength weapons like railguns and Skyray gunships, they have a lot more tools in the toolbox to shore up that weakness. Being relatively mobile and having some good utility means that the faction's good at scoring secondaries already. Their damage output is great, and they even have some solid midboard control with their cheap infantry and ghost kill battlesuits not being able to be shot off of objectives in the center of the table. And that moves us on to Chaos Space Marines. These guys were already in this upper tier. Moving on into the data slate, they got a couple points nerfs, but other than that, remained kind of the same. And we're already seeing some results come out of Chaos Space Marine players. They have incredible stratagems. They didn't really rely too heavily on stratagem duplication, and the stratagems that they most often used are still usable, being battle tactics by Chaos Lords to duplicate them with their Rites of Battle ability. And they have some of the best mid-range shooting in the game. They saw some points increases to units like Forge Fiends, but those guys are still useful. They're still perfectly efficient for their points value, and they can still fall back on units like Obliterators and their Supreme Melee, with Chosen Chaos Space Marines and Accursed Cultists making up the front line. That moves us on to the end of Tier 2. We have Orks. These guys basically got a side grade in terms of points. Their trucks and some of their transports went up, which was kind of to be expected. Trucks were kind of ludicrously cheap, but a lot of their infantry went down, meaning that the army largely stays the same. Orks were already poised to do relatively well in the pre-data slate season, and having some of their worst predators nerfed, whereas they didn't really receive any negative changes, means that they're just looking good to play well in the new season. They have good tools and aggressive play that can get around most of the low model count armies in the game. While they do potentially fall prey to being an aggressive infantry-focused faction and being swept off the table, I think the fact that they're much more efficient than a lot of the infantry clearing now means that they have a lot more tools to win those matchups. We saw Orks in the pre-data slate season scoring ridiculously high scores, being extremely consistent on both primary and secondary objective scoring, and having some pretty solid damage output into some specific matchups. And I don't think that's changed, whereas a lot of their bad matchups haven't been nerfed, and that just puts the faction in a very good place to compete moving on. Next up, we have Black Templars to talk about. These guys were the recipients of some very targeted points decreases to their most powerful units. Units like Sword Brethren are now cheap as chips to take, and they can take extremely efficient units like Crusader squads for backline objective holding. Honestly, they're the Horde mode Space Marines that they always wanted to be. They're incredibly lethal in melee. Points decreases to Space Marine units affected a lot of the units that these guys wanted to take. Land Raiders and other transports did see decreases, and their infantry is more efficient on top of that. Overall, it's all coming up good for the Black Templars, and the units that they got nerfed, they weren't necessarily running in large numbers anyway. You didn't see too many Desolation Marines in Black Templars armies because they didn't really synergize with their core detachment, so the nerfs to Space Marines didn't really affect this sub-faction that much. It'd be interesting to see whether this holds up, but it does seem like Black Templars are poised to be extremely effective moving on into the new season. And that puts us up to Tier 1. These are armies that we're probably going to be seeing pretty often moving on into the future. Moving on to, we have Necrons. These guys were already doing relatively well in the pre-data slate season. While they certainly didn't hold a candle to Custodes, Genestealer Cults, or Aeldari, they weren't too far behind them, and they really only got some points side grades in the data slate update. While some of their most played units like Cryptothralls and Lich Guard did get hefty points increases, a lot of their other extremely highly played units like Loskith's Heavy Destroyers got downgrades. They also didn't see any changes to characters like their Transcendent Catan, and those guys are still going to be floating around tabletops in the upcoming season being absolutely obnoxious to kill. In my opinion, Necrons have mostly side-graded rather than basically just windmill slamming 20 Lich Guard on the table in every single instance. They're going to be taking a more diverse selection of units, playing potentially one unit of Warriors and one unit of Lich Guard to diversify their threats, or even taking some of the larger super heavies, which now benefit not only from the towering changes, able to hide themselves, but also saw some hefty points decreases as well. Overall, that retains a lot of Necron efficiency. They're still ridiculously hard to kill, and a lot of their worst matchup factions like Adepta Custodes got significantly nerfed. The changes to Devastating Wounds also helped the faction because they took a lot of high volume units. So Devastating Wounds blasts, especially from factions like Aeldari, were able to just do absolutely unrecoverable damage to them that they couldn't reanimate through. Now that those Devastating Wounds simply kill individual Lich Guard or Crypto Thralls, that's not too big of a deal, and they can suffer that damage, reanimate through it, and continue to dominate you on primary. The big downside of Necrons is that they are relatively slow, but I think the fact that a lot of their utility units, like the Catan Shard and Tomb Blades, remained unchanged, and Tomb Blades even probably got a huge buff given the fact that they have high volume Devastating Wounds at 1 damage, which is exactly where you want to be in order to punch through high defense infantry like Adeptus Custodes, while counteracting their anti-mortal wound technology means that the faction is probably doing just fine. The first one to talk about is Dark Angels. These guys did see some nerfs. These guys were the recipients of some nerfs from the changes to Space Marines. Losing access to things like Desolators, or at least efficient access to units like that, is unfortunate, but the thing that Space Marines were really missing, that Desolators sort of, to some extent, shored up the weakness of the faction, was a strong mid-board presence. If your opponents moved units up into the middle of the table, it was difficult for Space Marines to be able to answer those efficiently. What they could do, however, was trade with their utility units, put smaller, cheap units in the center of the table, and then shoot those offending enemy units off from out of line of sight with Desolators and Whirlwinds. Dark Angels, however, don't really have that problem. They can dominate the midboard with Deathwing Knights. Deathwing Knights didn't get any nerfs, and a lot of the other more aggressive units in the Space Marine Codex, things like Aggressors, that we already saw being played in Dark Angels lists to pull focus from those Deathwing Knights, got points decreases. A lot of the most competitive Dark Angels lists just went down in points without really getting any other changes, and were relatively effective. It is, to be fair, largely based on the power of Gladius Task Force, since it synergizes with basically everything that Dark Angels wants to do much better than their Unforgiven Task Force, which is unfortunate for the faction, but I think being saddled with one of the strongest detachments in the entire game is probably an okay place for your faction to be. Not to mention the fact that there's probably a pretty solid chance that they get access to the new Codex chapters once that Codex comes out, which means that it's probably only up to go from here. I don't think we're going to see Dark Angels drop in power level anytime soon, and they're probably just going to get more options for interesting ways to play. Wouldn't be shocked if the First Company Task Force detachment is extremely strong for these Deathwing Knight specific builds. And that moves us on to the number 1 faction in the game. It's still Eldar. That's kind of a shocker, to be honest. Eldar were so dominant moving into the Dataslate, I think I and a bunch of other community members kind of expected the hammer to descend upon them with the might of Thor and knock them back into the Stone Age with faction-wide points increases. I think ultimately it means that the faction is significantly less efficient than it was previously, so while they are still the best faction in the game and are already starting to put up results in 5-round events, the truth of the matter is that they are going to be harder to play, and it's going to be harder to get those results for Eldar players than it was previously. In the past season, you could basically just like write a Wraith Knight on your list and accept your 4 free wins and maybe work in the mirror match in the final round, but now you actually have to work for it. While the points nerfs and the nerfs to Phantasm did, I think, reduce the variability of the faction, so they're mostly going to be focusing on lists centered around Wraithguard units that can benefit from that Phantasm. It does mean that they are less of a stat check than they were. If you have the opportunity to pin Wraithguard and shoot them to death, they will just die, unlike a Wraith Knight, which could potentially just survive forever. On top of that, kind of a buff to the faction was the changes to the stratagem mechanics, means that nerf to Phantasm is actually kind of a side grade. You can only use it on infantry now, but on the flip side, it can't be CP taxed by your opponent, so Eldar as a faction that never really used CP tax mechanics anyway, just relying on their Autarch Skyleapers to fuel their CP economy, are kind of celebrating a little bit. A little shocking that Eldar didn't get hit as hard as other factions. We saw factions that were doing significantly worse than them get sort of equal or worse nerfs to them. I'm looking at factions like Imperial Knights that got fundamental mechanical reworks, whereas Eldar were sort of escaped those. I like that we'll still see Eldar on the table, and well, Eldar I do think are still going to be very dominant, whereas previously a lot of games against Eldar, if you weren't playing a top 3 or 4 faction were essentially a foregone conclusion, and you might as well pack up your models and go home. Now, I believe that most factions have the potential to be able to beat them. Whether or not that remains true throughout the season, and maybe some technology to defeat the Wraithguard style armies more consistently start to prop up, I do think that there is a potential that Eldar don't have the attack volume anymore to deal with infantry hordes, especially since their devastating wounds weapons no longer split damage between single wound models. So there is maybe the potential that Necron Silvertide or Tyranids Unending Swarm could push them out. We'll just have to see. And with that, that is every faction in Warhammer 40k. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about my tier list, and if you disagreed with any of the points that I made. If I've forgotten anything about particular factions or matchups, let me know as well. I'm looking forward to see what you have to say. And with that, big thanks to Everwinter for sponsoring this video. Thanks for you for watching all the way to the end. And thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. You all keep the Tactical Tortoise world spinning over there. Remember to keep it classy, folks. And happy wargaming.